Elise Hickman is a graduate student in my lab, and she really highlights what I've been talking about in terms of science is not just laboratory research anymore. She has really done some phenomenal laboratory research, but also done an incredible job in really getting the message out and really becoming a teacher and science communicator. So Elise is a fourth year graduate student in my lab. She's already published papers, and she's doing some phenomenal work related to vaping and e-cigarettes in my group.
Thanks for that introduction, Alona. I'm really excited to answer all of your questions. So whoever's going first, yeah, shoot.
We have Zoe first.
How did vaping get so popular, and why are smoking and vaping addictive?
That's kind of is the question that got it all started. E-cigarettes became really popular, and so e-cigarettes were actually invented in China by a man named Han Lick, and his father died because of smoking, and he himself was a smoker, and so he invented these devices to theoretically help people quit smoking cigarettes. But as you all probably know, or you might have seen in your schools, nowadays a lot of people who weren't originally cigarette smokers have started using e-cigarettes. And this is because they were marketed to a lot of people, to a lot of young people, using tactics that were similar to the way that cigarettes were marketed before people knew that they were bad for your health. And so I'm just gonna share my screen real quick to show you all some examples of these marketing approaches. So you can see here on the top row are cigarette or old cigarette ads. And you can see that they portray people as cool. They use a lot of fun colors. Maybe they're trying to market to men by using this sort of manly stereotype. And when you look at some of the ads for e-cigarettes like Juul, which has been really popular, or another device like Blue, you can see just how similar these ads are. And so the tobacco companies have been using these same tactics to market e-cigarettes that they used to use to market cigarettes. And you might wonder then, okay, so they've gotten you to use e-cigarettes, why are they so addictive? And they both contain nicotine, and nicotine is a chemical that when you inhale it, it goes to your brain and it causes the release of another chemical called dopamine. And dopamine is a feel-good chemical. When you get something that gives you dopamine, you want to keep having that thing. And the more that you have nicotine, the more that it trains your brain to need that nicotine to get that dopamine release. And so that's why when you use nicotine, it's something that it's really addictive. Some scientists say that it's as addictive as drugs like cocaine. You just want to keep coming back to it and keep using it. And that makes it really, really hard to stop using it once you've started.
All right, our next question is from Channing.
How bad is vaping? Can it kill you? And are there toxic chemicals in them?
Yeah, so this is a question that everyone wants to know the answer to because, and that's why we're doing the research that we're doing, because e-cigarettes have only been out for a little over 10 years. And so we've only been doing research on them for that long. There have been isolated cases where people have died because of using e-cigarettes. Some of you may have heard of e-valley or e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury or illness. And this was mostly attributed to vaping marijuana products that had vitamin E acetate in them. And so with this outbreak, I think 60 to 70 people did die as a result of these exposures. But we're still doing research on what the health effects of e-cigarettes are. If you think about smoking, people smoked cigarettes for hundreds of years before it was finally accepted that they caused these negative health effects. So we're still in the young days of e-cigarette research, but we do know that e-cigarettes contain a lot of chemicals, and we know that some of these chemicals have been linked to toxic outcomes. And so we have another slide here kind of focused on some of these chemicals. So there are a handful of chemicals that are found in pretty much all e-cigarettes, such as the base chemicals, propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, nicotine or nicotine salts, like we just talked about, flavoring chemicals, that's what gives it the nice taste, the nice smell. And then sometimes there are contaminants. And there aren't only these chemicals, because when you heat up the e-cigarette, even more chemicals are generated from the breakdown of the initial chemicals. And so we already know that some of these are toxic, like formaldehyde and acrolein, which you might have heard of. And the aerosol can also contain things like metal from the coils and other volatile particles that were generated when the liquid was heated up. So we know that there are toxic chemicals in there, but we're still trying to figure out exactly how they affect the lungs, and what dose are people getting of these chemicals.
All right, our next question will be read by Anthony.
Okay. Is vaping actually better for you than smoking? Which has the worst effects, and does smoking increase your chances of COVID?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so when we think about smoking and vaping, right? Some people do try to use vaping to quit smoking. Some people just start vaping when they haven't been smoking. But it's a really hard comparison to make, because as toxicologists, we're thinking about what are the chemicals that we're being exposed to and what health effects do those chemicals cause. But smoking and vaping actually give you a pretty different chemical exposure. So if you look at this slide here, you can see that even though they both involve inhaling nicotine, you're inhaling something for both of them, and there's some sort of heat involved, they're actually a pretty different chemical exposure, because smoking is a combustion of tobacco, whereas vaping is an aerosolization of a liquid. With smoking, there aren't really many flavors, whereas with vaping, you can have a lot of different flavors, which means there are a lot of different chemicals that you can be exposed to as part of those flavors. With smoking, there aren't that many settings. You can't really change the setting on a cigarette, but with vaping, you can pick from a lot of different devices, and some of those devices have a lot of different settings within them. And smoking is pretty highly regulated, whereas vaping doesn't have quite as many regulations. So when we're thinking about the chemical exposure, it's like comparing apples to oranges. They're somewhat similar, but we might not necessarily expect for the health effects to be on a spectrum of better to worse. They might just be different. And something that is a good example of this are these pictures that some of our collaborators took of people's airways. And they took it from this area right here where the airways branch. What you can see is that the non-smoker has pretty healthy looking airways. They're kind of a light pink. There's not a lot of mucus or anything. But when you look at the smoker, you can see it's kind of reddened and that there's a lot of mucus. Then when we look at the picture of the vapor, can see how red and angry the airways look. And the person who did this procedure said, if you were to touch it, it would be kind of friable and flaky and not very healthy in texture. So this kind of exemplifies how we don't necessarily expect the health effects from smoking and vaping to be the same. They might just be different. And then I think you also asked about vaping and COVID. And that's something that we really want to know and that we're hoping to look into in our lab. We don't know specifically about vaping and COVID yet, but we do know that vaping can impair the way the body responds to an infection like the flu. So people have studied using either animals that they expose to e-cigarettes or studying people who are vapors. And you see that when vaping is present, you're not as well able to respond to that flu infection. So we might think that a similar process could go on with COVID, but we haven't looked into that specifically.
Cool. Our next question will be read by Isabel.
Why do you become a scientist? What is it like being a graduate student?
So I became, kind of like Alona, I've always been really interested in science, and I kind of knew probably around middle school or high school that I wanted to be a scientist, but I didn't really know what kind of science I wanted to do. And I knew I wanted to do something that helped human health, but I didn't really want to be a doctor. And I also knew that I really liked the process of discovering new things, because it's really exciting to me to every day get to go to work and to do something that I find really interesting. And so I think toxicology is a good intersection between human health and biology and chemistry, which are all subjects that I really loved when I was in school. And so that's kind of how I found my way to toxicology. And so being a grad student is fun because you basically you have your own projects that you get to work on, and you're pursuing something that people have never known before. So in my research, I'm looking at the health effects of e-cigarettes, but grad students in all different areas of science all have their own different projects. And so my things that I do on a daily basis are anything from doing experiments in the lab, so using pipettes and exposing cells to things, or measuring different proteins that the cells are making, to writing papers or making presentations to share my research either with other scientists or with people like you and the general public. It's also just a lot of collaborating and talking to other scientists and talking to lab mates about your science and seeing kind of where it goes. So it's nice because there's a wide variety of things that you get to do every day.
And this is our last question on the list from Elijah.
What advice do you have for teenagers interested in science?
I think for any of you who are interested in science right now, and this is somewhat similar to what Alona said, I would say just explore different types of science, because when you're in school, a lot of times you just have one science class, but in reality, there's so many different fields of science, and sometimes they're just very different from each other in what they're focused on. And so I would say just explore as many as you can. Figuring out what you don't like can be just as valuable as figuring out what you do like. So don't be afraid to try things out, to ask questions, and to just explore, because you have lots of time. And so just take advantage of that to figure out what it is that you want to do. And learn coding. I would also agree with Alona on that. I think that's going to be really valuable.